Hi, this is Michelle Capobianco. I'm the CEO of Pancreatic Cancer Canada, and you're listening to our podcast, Unapologetic.
So my guest today is Kayla Moryoussef, and she is a death doula. We're really excited to talk to you today and hear about what you do and why you do it and the value that it brings to patients. So do you want to tell me, just to start off, how you got into this to begin with?
I definitely think I was born for it. My primary parent, my grandmother, died when I was 15, and I was there for her entire journey. I remember I was supposed to work the day she died, and I was like, not going to work today, Mom. And my mom was like, go to work and come to the hospital after. And I didn't. I was working at a day camp, so I would have got there at 3:30, and my grandma died just after 3. So I was there for her last breath and everything. And I remember, obviously it was sad and everything, but being really taken by how profound it was too, moved by it. And I always wanted to be a helper, and being really moved by the fact that this affected everybody. Death was a thing that everybody was touched by. And so I was really moved by just how profound that was. And it never left me. I always kind of was the person who went to funerals with my friends or family to be their support. So when I was working in the music industry, I knew I needed to be in a helping profession, never left me. And I was looking for a volunteer opportunity that would train me and just put me in the field without credentials or experience. And God bless Hospice Toronto. Goodness bless Hospice Toronto. They were willing to train me over 40 hours of training. It's a unified training for all of Ontario. Every hospice volunteer gets the same training, and you get then more specified training if you're doing in-home versus residential. I wanted to specialize on in-home hospice because it gets the least funding. And I did the training, and I was like, this just makes perfect sense. Why aren't we focusing more on end-of-life care? Why aren't people talking about it more? And I hoped it would translate when I actually walked into the home of the dying client, and it did. I was good at it. I loved it. And I was like, this is what I'm built to do. So then I went to school to bolster my credentials to actually become a community worker and social service worker. And then I found out I was volunteering for Home Hospice Association, and I found out that death doulas existed. And it just made perfect sense. I was like, that's what I got to be doing. So I did the training as a death doula, and any other professional development training I can do in grief, loss, dying, and death, I do. I'm not an academic, but I love learning. And because it's the experiences are so diverse, there's so much to learn, right?
How have your friends and family reacted to this change in profession for you and your interest in death? Because I find when I talk to people about what I do for a living, and that pancreatic cancer is basically a death sentence, so the majority of people I work with are going to be dying. It really ends the conversation usually. People just want to stop the conversation. So how have your friends and family reacted?
Everyone always knew I wanted to be in a helping profession. So I'm like a hyper empathetic person and a very compassionate person. So nobody was surprised in that regard. Some people are more comfortable talking about what I do than others. I still do run some death cafes, which are just open forum conversations about dying and death. My best friend in the whole world has never come to one, and he won't. And I don't push people to come to them, because if it's not the right environment for you, it's not the right environment for you. It'll be unpleasant and damaging. But then I've had family members come to them and really start getting involved in these conversations in advanced care planning. It's definitely made everyone uncomfortable at the beginning. I had to fight to convince people that this was something the world needed, actually. It wasn't like it made sense to everybody, and now it makes sense to everybody, right? But it blew my mind that I had to convince people we needed end-of-life caregiving. And experts who really took care of the whole self piece, as opposed to just the medical piece, or just the support, just the meal and the housework piece, but the whole person piece.
It's not surprising to me, because when you talk to palliative physicians, they often talk about the fact that they're not brought in till near the end, till someone's near the end of life. And in fact, palliative is not a stage. And yet it's referred to as a stage, that patient is now palliative. And what the patient actually needs is palliative care from the moment of diagnosis of any life-threatening illness.
Palliate means to ease. I prefer to be brought in as soon as there's a diagnosis. I work with a lot of people who don't have diagnoses, because we're all dying and we all have something to plan for. So I don't think I don't think it's ever too early really to start planning for this. I always tell people, I had a conversation with somebody the other day and I said, what are you going to do if you ever got a diagnosis and decisions and choices are coming at you a mile a minute? It's too late to access half of them. It's too late to think about half of them.
Yeah.
That's not the time to think about them.
Well, I'm always
just wait till they get a diagnosis or till they'll cross that bridge when they get there. It's too late when you get to that bridge.
Yeah, exactly. Or they're halfway across the bridge and they realize that they're going to be dying very soon, and then that's sort of done with it. I'm always talking to patients about the fear of death is the one fear that everybody has that's actually going to happen.
Yeah, it's really like counterintuitive. It's really counterintuitive. It's really crippling. And it's really, I see people like come around and I've always known or I progressively feel how liberating and empowering dealing in death is, because once you take it on, I tell people, the younger people who come to me who aren't dying, I do the same thing with them that I do with my dying clients, which is plan for death. Because if you have that plan in a drawer, you don't have to worry about it anymore. I've planned for death. And I've planned for end of life, and I've planned for choices I might need to make. And it's there. Now I can stop worrying about it, right? And so there's, I think there's two problems in our death-denying society. And I think there's two things we need to take on at the same time, which is our fear of talking about dying and death and our fear of dying and death. And we need to do both at the same time, which is take on the actual fact and take on the dialogue, which is what we're doing right now, right?
It's exactly what we're doing right now. Do you talk to people in your profession outside of North America? Because I find studying some of the rites and rituals that people undertake in other countries, they embrace death so much more than we do in North America.
Well, my profession isn't a profession so much outside of North America because it's less needed. There are a lot of cultures that take care of their dying. This concept that it takes a village to raise a baby, and then I always say it takes a village to nurture a human. It takes a village to care for the dying. That's what they say at Home Hospice Association, where I work and volunteer. And I agree. And I agree with that philosophy wholeheartedly. It takes a village to care for the dying. Village mentality has not died all around the world. Village mentality doesn't exist in Western culture anymore. That's why we're requiring expert. I would prefer my job to not have to exist. I would, a lot of what I do in the training and the teaching I do is actually help communities learn how to take care of their dying more. And I'd love to see more of that, right? And for families, and I'd love to see governments, if we were talking about this more, governments would talk about this more. There'd be more funding for family caregivers. That's the thing that needs to happen, right? We're so afraid to talk about it. Politicians aren't talking about it. So there's no policy protecting caregivers. There's no policy protecting people who are dying. If you need funding from the government, if you find out you're dying and can't work tomorrow, there's no automatic funding from the government.
That's insane.
There's no sudden disability you can go on because you're terminally ill. You got to wait just like everyone else trying to wait for disability. It is insane. But why would the government talk about it if nobody else wants to talk about it? Nobody's pressuring the government because no one wants to talk about dying and death, even though everyone's going to die. That's insane to me.
Yeah, I agree. So tell me more about training families. How could that work once a family member had a diagnosis? How long would the training take?
Well, it's not training so much as I journey alongside the family the family caregivers. That's a lot of my training is to journey alongside the family caregivers as much as the dying person. It's always client-centered caregiving, but it's to educate the family as much as to educate the client, to help the family feel empowered. How can you care for your loved one as this progresses? What can you do? How can you feel empowered? And you hear so many families say they feel so powerless. They feel so powerless, especially when somebody's dying, because we live in a society where you won if you've beat the cancer and you've lost if the person dies. How powerless has that language left families feeling? So how do we re-empower families by saying, here are the sponges you can use to wet your loved one's mouth when their mouth dries as, the dying process kind of takes over. Here is what if their body hurts, there's the palliative handshake. So even though you think it might hurt, just slide your hand under their hand. And if they want to, they'll grasp your hand. And even if they don't, just leave your hand there. Get into bed next to them. Things they can do.
Fabulous. I'll tell you, just to go back to what you were talking about with governments being so far behind, I recently worked with a family in Alberta, and the patient chose MAID and went through the experience, and it had gone through the experience all the way you're supposed to. So he had applied, he'd had the proper people come out, the proper forms were filled out. But then 3 days after he passed, the coroner called the widow and wanted her to come in and identify the body because they classify MAID as a irregular death.
They classify it as however the person died usually, or they should, but they must have had him.
Well, not only that, but then 2 weeks later, she received a letter from the coroner that said that they were now investigating his death as suspicious. And when you go down and read the reasons why they might be investigating a suspicious death, MAID was actually listed as one of the reasons. So it's not a matter of the concept of MAID having caught up.
And they haven't.
It's a matter, but it's even worse because they managed to put MAID in the documents, but they're still calling MAID so unnatural that a coroner has to investigate.
Hugely, there's so many things problematic in our system dealing with people who are ill, let alone people who are dying. And then if you have a disability or you're marginalized and you're in the system and you're dying, good luck. To expand since COVID, we're so short-staffed on nurses and the people who were providing, and social workers and the people who were providing closer to that whole self-care. And still it wasn't, I'm the fights the advocacy I really fight for just to get passes for people and stuff since COVID, or to have one last meal. Can you get us a room in the hospital where this person and their 2 children can lift their masks off for 2 hours and have a meal together? Because this person's been in the hospital for a year. They're going to be in the hospital for 3 more months and they're going to die. And they have one request: to have one last meal with their family. You can facilitate this.
How can we get patients, their families, and those left behind to advocate? What could they do? What are some tangible things they could do?
I think by being educated, how can we by feeling empowered, knowing they have a voice, right? But I think it's by planning early, right? If they are it is overwhelming. If you don't plan, you don't have time to do the advocacy for the nice things, for the pleasantries. You are overcome and overwhelmed with all the decisions you have to make about pragmatic treatment and about all the practical things coming up, to think about what would I like? Becomes a really hard, there's no time, there's so much less time for it. What can you do is start planning and educating now. Not about every disease, not about everything, but about what you can.
So and about what you want your death to look like. So are there sort of a list of questions that you can ask yourself, or is there a place to go? Maybe we need to put some of that on our website to give people more information.
I think it's Advanced Care Planning Canada, so I think it's Speak Up. I don't want to give you the wrong website, but if you Google Speak Up Canada or Advanced Care Planning Canada, each province might be a little different, but there's usually for the ACP, for the Advanced Care Planning Guide, which is a lot of your advanced care planning process. There's some sort of guide that they'll lead you through. That's some of the questions. Other things to think about for when you're actively dying. What would you like to tell who do you want around? The who, what, when, where, why, or not why so much, the who, what, when, where. Sounds, smells, sights, and sounds. Tastes, I say, for even earlier. Don't leave the things you want to eat before you die. The moment you find out you're dying, start eating those things, because as you get sicker, it's going to get harder to eat those things. So the taste is the one thing I don't leave for when you're actively dying. But otherwise, if you know you're going to want to feel a certain fabric, I spoke to one woman who said she lived in a monastery. I've told the story before. She lived in a monastery and with the monks, and she wanted to die feeling the fabric of the robes they wore. So prepare for that. Let's access that robe. Make sure she has it for when she's actively dying, so she can die feeling that fabric around her. That's just one example. So the details of when you're actively dying, to have that ready. sounds, what do you want to hear? Is that playlist ready? Is the way you're going to play the music, the actual hardware, the speaker, whatever, Spotify, is that all ready? What do you want to leave to if you're accessing MAID? Even if you're not accessing MAID, if those things are ready. We got to the hospital in the morning and knew my grandma was going to die that afternoon, or that day. And not everyone has that privilege, but what you see in the movie is this traumatic death, this monster in the closet that we've created, is not the majority. It's not the majority. And between video games and movies and television, I think the Western world, half the reason we're death denying is because we think the majority of deaths are traumatic. They don't need to be. They're traumatic because we don't talk about them and we don't plan for them. If we talked about them and planned for them, they wouldn't be traumatic.
That's fascinating. That is really interesting. You're right, because we do look at death as traumatic. So thank you all for joining me for part 1 of our conversation with death doula Kayla Moryoussef. We really enjoyed having the opportunity to talk to her about her passion for her job and helping people with end of life. And stay tuned for the second half of that conversation.
Thank you for listening. To learn more about us, visit www.pancreaticcancercanada.ca and stay tuned for the next episode of Unapologetic.